Hello, everyone. Today, our conversation is going to focus on stakeholder engagement from rhetoric to meaningful practice. This is an article written by Neil Jeffrey in 2009. So, let me start with a scenario that most of you have either experienced or possibly will. As an organization rolls out a major initiative, it might be a policy change, a restructuring, a budget reallocation, a new operational strategy, whatever it might be, leadership believes the decision is sound, the analysis is strong, and the data supports it. But what happens next? Stakeholders push back, community members question motives, internal personnel resist implementation, and trust erodes. And leadership is left asking this very simple question: why are they reacting this way? Now, here's really the harder question. Was the resistance about the decision or was it about the process? Neil Jeffrey's work forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Poor stakeholder engagement doesn't just fail to build support, it actively damages legitimacy. And at the graduate level, especially for those of you operating in the public administration or public safety, this isn't theoretical, it's operational. When engagement is symbolic, stakeholders recognize it immediately. When influence is promised but not delivered, credibility declines. And when leaders treat engagement as messaging rather than governance, distrust compounds. Jeffrey's core warning is quite blunt. Bad engagement is worse than no engagement because once expectations are raised, they are almost impossible to recalibrate. So today, as we work through the opening section of Jeffrey's framework, I want you thinking of systems level, not how do we communicate better, but how do we design engagement so that influence is real, expectations are aligned, and legitimacy is strengthened rather than depleted. Stakeholder engagement is no longer optional in modern governance. Authority is scrutinized, decisions are contested, and legitimacy is fragile. The question isn't whether you engage, it's whether your engagement reinforces trust or quietly erodes it. So let's examine what Jeffrey means by meaningful engagement and why most organizations get it wrong. Jeffrey begins by reframing engagement as a governance reality, not a leadership performance issue. Organizations today operate environments where decisions are contested, authority is questioned, and legitimacy is fragile. Ignoring stakeholders doesn't avoid conflict, it delays it and usually intensifies it. For public safety leaders, this should feel familiar. The absence of engagement almost always shows up later, under worse conditions. Jeffrey draws a really sharp distinction here. Crisis management? Well, crisis management is reactive, and stakeholder management is still organization centered. True stakeholder engagement's different. It's interactive, it's relational, and it requires a willingness to adapt. If your goal is to control the conversation, you're not engaging, you're managing the optics. And stakeholders can tell the difference immediately. This is where engagement gets uncomfortable. Jeffrey argues that meaningful engagement requires the leaders to do the following: listen with intent, balance stakeholder wants and needs with organizational wants and needs, accept uncertainty about outcomes. I love this one paragraph here because I know for many of us, having this ambiguity is really challenging, and yet it's almost something that has to take place to be successful. If nothing is open to change, then engagement is symbolic at best and deceptive at worst. One of Jeffrey's strongest warning appears early. Bad engagement is worse than no engagement. Why? Why is that the case? Because once expectations are raised, They are very hard to lower. Post crisis town halls, defensive listening sessions, and engagement after decisions are locked in often deepen mistrust instead of repairing it. In public safety, this pattern shows up constantly and predictably. Jeffrey is clear. Engagement is not a one time event. It's not a meeting, it's not a survey, and it's not a checkbox. Engagement is relational work over time. What you think about that? It's relational work over time. Trust develops through consistency, follow through, and demonstrated learning. One off engagements may inform, but it rarely legitimizes. This is a defining standard in the reading. Stakeholders must have more than a voice, they must have credible influence. That doesn't mean leaders surrender authority, it means participants understand what decisions are open, what constraints exist, and how input shaped outcomes. Voice without influence feels performative, and performative engagement destroys trust. I think as you look at the IEP too, which we'll talk about in the course, oftentimes we love to inform, but rarely do we engage, and empowerment is almost non existent. And I think he's trying to find somewhere along this continuum that is a practical standard for us to consider. Jeffrey cautions against a common shortcut. Engagement or engaging only the loudest and most organized or the most agreeable stakeholders. That's convenient, but it's illegitimate. Meaningful engagement requires reaching less visible voices, less powerful groups, those most affected, not most available. Convenience biases outcomes and undermines credibility. So, engagement cannot live solely in a communications office. When engagement languages outpaces leadership behavior, credibility collapses. Value statements without follow through create legitimacy gaps that are hard to close. Stakeholders judge engagement by actions, not messages. Jeffrey reframes resistance in a powerful way. When engagement fails, the cause is rarely difficult stakeholders. More often, it's the following: there was an unclear purpose, hidden constraints, poor preparation, or misaligned expectations. Resistance is not obstruction, it's diagnostic information. The design failed to match the moment. So Jeffrey ends this section by shifting perspective. Engagement isn't just about avoiding backlash. When done well, when done well, it surfaces new ideas, builds partnerships, increases adaptive capacity, and strengthens institutional learning. Organizations that treat engagement as learning, not damage control, are better positioned for uncertainty. For public safety leaders, implications are direct. Engagement after decisions are made undermines trust. Authority without listening accelerates legitimacy loss. Command presence still matters, but so does humility. Engagement quality signals intention. Engagement quality signals intentional intent. So let's bring this together at a level that matters most: leadership responsibility. Stakeholder engagement is not a soft skill. It is not a public relations exercise, and it's not a courtesy extended when convenient. It's a structure component of governance. Jeffrey's argument is not simply that engagement is important, his argument is that poorly designed engagement accelerates distrust. When influence is unclear, stakeholders assume manipulation. When expectations are raised but not met, legitimacy declines. And when engagement is reactive instead of relational, conflict intensifies rather than resolves. So here's the turning point. Engagement failure is rarely caused by difficult stakeholders. They are most often caused by unclear purpose, hidden constraints, or misaligned expectation. In other words, design failures. And design is a leadership function. Meaningful engagement requires discipline. It requires clarity about what is actually open to change. It requires patience to build relationship over time. And it requires humility to accept the good ideas that may not reside exclusively inside the organization. Not weak leadership, it's demanding leadership. So here's the question I want you to sit with before our next discussion. When has engagement in your organization created the appearance of influence without delivering real influence? What happened next? Did trust improve or did skepticism deepen? Because stakeholders are no longer evaluating your intentions, they are evaluating the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. And that gap defines credibility. If engagement is unavoidable, and Jeffrey makes it very clear that is, then real strategic question becomes this. Are you designing engagement to learn or designing it to defend? That distinction determines whether engagement becomes a stabilizing force or a legitimacy risk. As you move into the discussion, I want you to thinking about, well, not just theory, but about architecture. If you had to redesign one engagement process in your organization tomorrow, what would you change? And what would you be willing or open to for influence? That's where meaningful engagement really begins. Well, that's it, folks. That's the end of this segment. I appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing everybody in class. And think about the questions that are posed here because it will give us an opportunity to have some discussions around the engagement process in your organization. So come prepared to talk about those. Thanks again. Have a good day.